Their side of the family, so they
It's
will.
exactly time.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. Read the short statement. In accordance with the Openness of Local Bodies Regulations 2014, this meeting is being live streamed and may otherwise be recorded, filmed or communicated on other media platforms. The recording of this meeting will be made available on the Council's YouTube channel shortly after the meeting. Both councillors and officers in attendance are reminded to make full use of and to speak clearly into the microphones available at all times. Reminder that mobile phones should be put on silent mode. You do not need to switch your phones off, but they need to be on silent and do not take any calls. Those present at the meeting should refrain from taking telephone calls. I'd like to welcome you all to the meeting. It's my first time on policy after 19 years, so it's going to be interesting. Right, agenda item 1, apologies for absence.
Apologies were received from the Vice Chair, Councillor Ridley, Councillor Boyce, Councillor Gamble, Councillor Frank Broadley, and Councillor Linda Broadley.
Thank you. Can I have nominations for a Vice Chair, please? Councillor Bolter.
Mrs. Morris.
Seconder?
I'll second that.
Thank you. Councillor Morris, would you like to come up? Item 2, appointment of substitutes. I don't think there are any. Item 3, declarations of interest. Councillor Geoffrey Kaufman.
Chair, agenda item 16. I have been involved or received correspondence from the prospective leasee, yeah. And I wish to declare that, but I'm here with a completely open mind when dealing with one of the items on item 16, agenda item 16.
Councillor Samia Hack.
Thank you, Chair. Same for me. I have had initial correspondence with the chairman of one of the OBL clubs.
Be very careful not to identify the individual or the organisation or declaration.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, had some correspondence with one of the
Perspective, that's all.
That's it. Thank you.
But you're here with an open mind.
I am, Chair.
Thank you. 4 minutes of the previous meeting. Councillor Geoffrey Kaufman.
Chair, we're very particular here to get things noted properly. Like agenda item 94 on page 5 to be slightly expanded and corrected, if I may. The first paragraph of 94 says that I left the chamber at 7:29 p.m, returned at 7:31 p.m. For the benefit of correctness, I've had this checked actually. I actually left the chamber at 7:29 and 17 seconds, according to the recording, and I returned at 7:30 and 30 seconds. The absence was of 73 seconds, and you weren't here, Chair, at that time. The 73 seconds that I was apparently out of the meeting deprived me of my vote and my ability to actually represent fully the people that send me here. And I think it's got to be noted correctly, because I think I was, the chair at the time was, I think, misadvised. So if that, the minutes could be expanded to include the accident, and this apparently has been checked on the recording.
Thank you, Councillor Kaufman. Just so there's no further confusion on this issue, if a member wishes to have a break an adjournment, that is no problem whatsoever. I don't want anybody to miss anything in this debate or be forced after being able to vote. So if anybody requires a break, just please indicate and we can do so. Thank you. Agenda item 5, action list.
There was no action.
No action list, thank you. 6, petitions and deputations.
Received.
None received, thank you. Right, into the meat of the meeting. 7, waste strategy and collection, guide for developers. John Wells.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, everyone. With housing growth in our area and the forecast in the coming years, it is becoming increasingly more important that future development can be provided in a way that not only meets planning policy, but is designed and laid out to ensure we can provide essential refuse and recycling services in both a safe and efficient manner. The guidance produced in Appendix 1 is appropriate to all types of development, from small housing extensions to large-scale residential development, commercial and mixed-use proposals. The guide recognises that high-quality design should be aimed at all those involved in the permitting process, and, if approved tonight, will provide advice to future developers and applicants at the start of the planning process. Our planning team and county, as our highway authority, have both been involved in this production. And as detailed in paragraph 2.4 of our report, this I see as the first step with the intention longer term to producing a formal supplementary planning guidance document. Thank you. Happy to take your questions.
Councillor Lily Kaufman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report. Page 14, number 5, apartment developments. I would like the sentence, this may change in the future. I want that sentence taken out. So if anybody's got any objections, I would like that amended. Thank you.
Councillor Bolter.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, on page 13, we have a policy only to supply 140 bins to residents in the borough unless they can prove of a need to use a bigger bin by a larger family. That policy is already in place. So on 4.4a, refuse really bin should only be 140 there, not the 240 option, because that will break our policy. So if we can do that, that would be helpful, Chair. And I agree with Mrs. Kaufman. We should take that little few words out about this may change in the future. It's not relevant at the present time.
Right. Are we going to take those 2 items as an amendment then?
Yes, I'll move the amendment if Mrs. Kaufman second it.
Yeah, I'll second that.
Thank you. Councillor Wells.
Just to clarify a couple of points, one of the proposals with refuse was that 240 litre might be acceptable for a large family. And that's something that was discussed at the FD, last November. Just to clarify that point. It's about this may, sorry, I'm finding the item again, this may change, was really to recognise legal requirements. So it might be, for example, food waste, in which case the service will have to change according to the requirements based on this grant and anything else. I thought I'd just put those on the table before you vote.
Chair, with respect, that's not so at the present time. We can only do what we know at the present time. That is something that may happen in the future. But Mr. Wells is right. We do the larger bins for large families, but they have to prove a need. That shouldn't be in the general report. The policy is already in place for that. So if somebody does need a larger bin, it can be supplied, but only on very rare occasions. We need to get the waste down, not encourage people to put it in the black bin.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bentley.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of points, if I could. On page 19, Appendix D, we talk about segregation and where containers should be and mixed-use development. Are we putting anything in place within this document to try and encourage recycling in communal areas in flats and things to be separate from waste. As I find at present, when we've got such places, they tend to have the recycling right next to the waste, and people tend to put the wrong type of stuff in the recycling. So is it possible that we segregate the actual areas of recycling and waste?
If I may, Chair, I think the overriding driver here is to maximise recycling opportunity. Unless the sheer waste strategy is all around use and recycle, and the introduction makes it clear there that is what our key priorities going forward. So it's absolutely essential that they can provide alternate facilities for recycling and refuse. Hence the design criteria. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. If I could just ask one question. Can this be applied, not retrospectively to what's already built, but the 600 houses on the direction for growth that have been approved but are far from being started and won't be for a couple of years maybe. Can we apply these policies to that?
The intention is that any planning application made in the future will apply this. Anything that's awaiting reserve matters and thereafter, so if the outline's been agreed, fine, but actually the layout and design, this is where it's critical. So I'd imagine in the case you described, Chair, that we can apply this document if members approve it tonight, yes.
Thank you. Does anybody else wish to speak?
Can I just clarify something? Just to make it clear, although the amendments were framed as an amendment, but nothing had been moved substantively. So if I understand correctly, Councillor Bolter is moving a substantive motion to include the amendments which both Councillor Bolter and Councillor Crawford have made, and you're seconding that substantive motion. That's correct. Thank you.
Thank you. And that motion. Sorry. Councillor Allen.
I just want to draw members' attention to page 14, please. Containers collection. There's an area on my ward, it's Dogwood Court. It's just off Manor Road. And many of the residents have to wheel their bins over to a collection point for the lorry to come down and collect their bins. Now, you've just said here, there's a line on this in this report. It says constructed to an adoptable standard as set out by the Highways Authority, Leicestershire County Council. Now, what are those adoptable standards? And where were they when that area was being developed? Because it's caused so many problems for residents there. And I just wonder what those adoptable standards actually are.
I don't know whether you can answer that, can you, Mr. Wells?
It's not a question, I'm not a highway expert. What I can clarify is this document is produced on avoiding issues like that occurring in the future. My role was very much looking at this and exploring the planning and waste link, if you like, in terms of I am aware that we're not unique. There are a lot of authorities in the country where sometimes development has been designed as well as it could have been. So the idea from this point onwards is we can avoid those sorts of circumstances arising.
And for the lorries to get through easier.
I think the principle behind it, the optimal standards make up a number of things, but in principle, yes, an RCV weighs 26 tonnes, it's rear wheel steer, it's difficult to manoeuvre. If it's a single carriageway and it's block paved, it won't be to an optimal standard.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Okay, the substantive before us is that we approve this policy with the two following changes. That the sentence on page 14, this may change in the future, and that refuse bins are only 120 litres. Is that correct?
40 litres.
On 40 litres. Okay, I'll put that to the vote now. All those in favour? That's unanimous, thank you. Agenda item 8, ethical standards and indicators. That's Mr Ball.
Thank you, Chair. This is the standard quarterly report to receive the figures for the local determination of complaints and ethical indicators referred to quarter 4 in 2021-22. As members would expect, the report provides information in relation to member complaints, corporate and employee complaints, FOI requests and ASB reports and resolutions. All that information for quarter 4 is contained in the appendix. The recommendation is to note the content of the report and the appendix attached there too. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
No? Okay, thank you. The report is down for noting. All right, we'll do it by a show of hands. Is everybody happy with the report? Thank you. Unanimous. Agenda item 9, volunteering policy. Tracy Bingham.
Chair, good evening members. So on behalf of the Head of Law and Democracy, I'll be taking this report this evening. This report sets out a revised volunteering policy, building on the existing policy that was developed in 2019. It sets out how the new volunteering programme, which has been developed following recommendations made by internal audit, will be administered and managed. There are two main parts to the report that need to be addressed specifically. Page 37 of agenda packs, where suggestions are made for additional volunteering opportunities that support the council's work directly. And these are linked with the expectation placed on managers to look for opportunities within their service areas. And then on page 7, there will be a paid working day off for council staff for pre-approved and agreed volunteering opportunities within the borough. And with that, I welcome any comments or questions and refer members to page 31, where the recommendation is to approve the policy.
Thank you, Tracy. Could I start off first? How did the 2019 policy do?
This is a very good question, Chair. I will have to take that back, I'm afraid. In the absence of our colleague, the Head of Law and Democracy, I think it's fair to say the policy was fit for purpose, but I think following the internal audit recommendations around the programme, that's why it's balancing. But in terms of how well did it do in the specifics, I would need to come back, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Nice to know. Councillor Bolter.
Chair, first of all, DBS checks, who pays for those? And the other one is on page 36. Bit concerned, it says advertise a single page on the council external facing website. I'd like to say when we do the paper copies going around the borough twice a year, I'd like to see it on that as well. And also perhaps something on the notice boards in the borough won't be going amiss either. So then you're captivating all people rather than just people look on the internet.
Okay, thank you.
At no additional cost to the council, of course.
Councillor Hack.
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly, there's lots in there what's required from the volunteers to become a volunteer. Is there anything in there that protects them against any complaints?
Again, if I'm a chair, I'll have to come back on that point, I'm afraid, Councillor Hack.
Thank you. Councillor Bentley.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question regarding the volunteering opportunities and oversight. One of the bullet points is community safety initiatives under the Community Safety Partnership banner, such as Community Speed Watch and Neighbourhood Watch. Is this actually something that the council assists with, especially Neighbourhood Watch? Because these initiatives were in quite some time ago and seem to have dropped off quite a lot. It's just becoming more and more apparent from residents that they're becoming more and more concerned, especially about speed around the borough. Maybe Councillor Lloyd could update us. Through you, Chair, of course.
Thank you.
Repeat the question.
Oh, I needed this one.
We're just interested about Community Speed Watch. And whether that's an initiative that's backed up by the council or is it mainly a police provision?
I'm with you. Yeah, the community speed watch is done by volunteers who are registered with the police and the local police station. I know them personally, so they do go out and do various activities and speed watches with little guns. They do. So yes. Not that, I mean, obviously they'll be looking for other volunteers as well, so I'm sure they'll be more than welcome.
So is that something then the council, through this document, is going to support and progress with the police?
Not being the report owner and stepping in reasonably short notice, I will have to take that away, I'm afraid, Chair, and think about it at a later date. And make the suggestion that the committee may wish to consider deferring this item if they wanted to obtain more information before approving.
Councillor Lloyd.
Sorry, I mean, if it helps, obviously that's a very point that was made. What we can do is get an agenda item on the CSP and ask for a report there from the police with regards to the volunteers and how they operate the speed events around the borough. They've done, just recently done Manor Road extension. I've got all the details from that. So if that's acceptable, we can move that forward and go to the CSP and get a report back to see how we can work with the council to develop. That helps.
Thank you. Councillor Bentley?
Yeah, my main point is that I want, especially things like Community Speed Watch, to be more advertised so that more people know about it, so that more people can join in. I mean, for quite a few years we've had our speed signs that are basically me going around with a ladder putting them on lampposts, and not a great deal of support on that, but if such things were widely advertised that they're available, like speed watch and the signs, we could possibly get more volunteers to assist and stop the speeding around the estates.
Councillor Lloyd.
If it helps, I think we need a process, don't we? We need a process to identify what Bentley has said, and if we get that through the CSP, get the relevant people around the table to develop that process, then you can advertise how it's going to work, who's going to do it, and make sure it's a benefit to the community at large. Because if you put something out there and say how you're going to do it, who's going to do it, I'm sure we've got better things to do than go out with your camera all the time on the demand that might come forward.
Very important.
So I think if we get the process right, then we can advertise it, and everyone's going to use it. If that helps.
Councillor Hack.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to go back to my point about protecting the volunteers. If we're going to have them doing speed watch, is something that they will be open to abuse. So we need to have proper procedures in place before we can have volunteers on that list and going out doing speed watch. So deferral, I think, is a good idea at this point.
Right. Councillor Joshi.
I think with the volunteer development, thank you, Chair, on page 40, we're talking about lots of training and the safeguarding and the GDPR, etc. I think we just need a bit of more clarity around who's going to provide the training and how it's going to be delivered, because this needs to be updated as long as they remain a volunteer almost yearly. Councillor
Lloydell again.
Thank you. That's a good point, actually. It's something that's on page 40 itself, from an health and safety point of view. The purpose of health and safety, all volunteers are in as employees. So they do come under the Health and Safety Work Act and be protected exactly the same as an employee. That's quite important that happens. On this paragraph that where volunteers may require specialist training, bit I need to clarify, it says training is provided and implemented to a suitable standard will fall to the individual responsible for the service of that relevant activity. Who is that? Just need clarifying who that, as soon as that for the responsibility of the individual responsible for the delivery of the local activity. Is that a member of staff? Is that a volunteer? Just needs clarifying, that's all. I think that's important that we get that in place and clarified, if that's okay. Yeah.
I think it's clear with the amount of queries and questions, and Tracy's in no position really to answer these. I think deferral is going to be the option, but do you want to add anything, Tracy?
No, Chair, thank you.
Okay, I think if the committee are minded, we'll defer this. Any objections? All in favour? Thank you. The item is deferred. Agenda item 10, maximising the council's income. Tracy again, please.
Thank you, Chair. So I have a fair bit to get through this evening on this report, so if you'll kindly ask members to bear with me while I go through this and reserve questions to the end of my presentation. So the report seeks to consult the committee this evening on some proposed new principles for adoption as part of a new corporate charging policy for the council, and that is planned to come forward over the coming months. The report also seeks to provide members with an update in respect of progress against new areas of income generation that were previously presented to the committee last November. So as set out in section 2 of the report, this council generates over £1.5 million in local income on its general fund. Income generation is a well-trodden path for local government, but our current performance, as identified by the LGH financial health check that was undertaken last summer, is at the lower end when compared to our peers. Of course, it is difficult to confirm whether higher performing income councils charge more for their services in comparison to us, or whether indeed they have more services that they levy a charge for. Unfortunately, that detailed benchmark, I think, isn't available unless we source that agreement with the council. But what I can say is currently there is not a policy in place to guide charge setting here. And so determining a new policy would be helpful for us in terms of introducing new charges, but also considering charging levels for existing fees and charges, and considering how we should vary them as part of setting the budget each year. And so it's proposed to implement a new member-approved policy. Now, in section 3 of the report, there are 4 fundamental principles that we propose, and members are invited to comment on these this evening, and indeed, and any others that you think are relevant. So the first principle is that we should, as a council, consistently raise income where we have a power to do so as a council, but that service areas are best placed to determine charges based on the customer impact of those charges and whether the service being provided meets a corporate objective. That's not to say that members would not be involved in the determination of charges, but it is service areas who are best placed to, as a start, identify the level of charges and then bring those forward through the budget setting process for members to approve. I think the other thing, the thing that's important here is to say that as part of this service assessment, a service could be delivered at a subsidised rate or indeed free. So when we are looking to identify charges, it may well be that as part of that assessment that a service undertakes, they do determine that to meet a service objective of the council, a service either continues or is given at free of charge or subsidised rate. So that's the first principle, and that's about consistency across the board. The second principle is linked to number 1, and that's that services should define a charging strategy. So that is, in the provision of the service, should that service or that fee or charge that is levied cover the cost of providing that service? Should we seek to make a surplus? Are we providing a service that is potentially commercially competitive, and therefore we should seek to achieve a surplus? Should we seek to recover our costs? If we subsidise the service, why do we do that? Is that because we're trying to support a particular segment of the community, or is it because we're trying to meet a different status objective? So, for example, an example might be sport pitches. So the councils may let sport pitches in their patches at a subsidised rate, and the reason for that is to encourage participation in sport. So that's a clear definition of why we might subsidise a fee or charge. Thirdly, so moving on, the third principle is around undertaking an impact assessment, and that's to ensure that the customer is at the heart of any fee and charge or service that is brought forward. And then finally, that charges are reviewed on an annual basis with members, and that's through the budget setting process. So they're the kind of starting principles for the charging policy, and again, looking for feedback on those this evening. On a practical basis, the new approach will require service areas to look at the financial performance of their charge-bearing services. And so we're looking to start with a small number of high-value income-generating areas this summer as part of setting the budget for next year. And then we're looking to roll out this new approach across all income-generating areas going forward. So moving on to section 4 of the report. This next section details the new ideas that were brought forward last November around income generation. Since then, work has progressed and we now have 5 concepts that we're planning on working up to full business case to be reviewed by the senior leadership team before they're presented to members again as part of setting the budget for next year. Linked to that, there is a budgetary provision in the existing capital programme, and that's detailed in the report, but I must point out that subject to the council decision on the capital programme, which is another item on this evening's agenda, the transformation budget will be allocated to the Brockfield project. So, to wrap up, I'm looking for input specifically this evening on the principles to a new corporate strategy, and feedback on 5 concepts around new income generating areas that we're looking to work up to full business case and bring back to you, subject to SLT review later in the year.
Okay, if I go first, the principles, I can speak to why we've done, get them in process, see how they work. Clearly we've not been getting in as much as we should have done compared to other authorities. It'd be nice to see how short we are of other authorities, so some evidence that we're not performing as we should. Comments on the 5 income streams putting forward. Work to be done. Well, we need a lot more evidence and facts before us. As Tracy has said, that'll be coming at a later date. But I'll leave comments to others. Councillor Geoffrey Kaufman.
Thank you, Chair. In principle, I can see nothing wrong with these. I think it's all laudable. We're persuaded by the government that we've got to sweat our assets. We have a duty to raise as much money as we can to pay for the services, and this is a way of achieving it. But I'm concerned as to why the council, when they've tried these things in the past, don't seem to make a profit. And if I can give an example, our rat man, vermin. Now, certainly every person that I know, their automatic person they would phone up, if they see a rat running, because I'm going to phone the council up. But we never seem to be able even to cover our costs. And I can see commercially, up and down, you look in, well, it used to be Yellow Pages, but look on the internet and you'll see dozens of firms that are making a small fortune out of getting rid of vermin and whatever it is. We have the first call that people would make, and we have, after years of struggling, had to drop that service. Now, I'm disappointed about that because I would expect, as a resident, that this is one of the services that the council would provide, and they would make a profit out of those paying normally, and perhaps need to subsidise some of those as are on benefits and things like that. Now, we can't seem to achieve that, and that's what worries me about some of the things down there. In the past, we haven't been good at running businesses. I look at the history over the years of our cafe in Brox Hill, Environment Centre. Wonderful situation, wonderful place. Never been able to make a go of it, because when we put it in, they've decided that as a matter of policy, we won't allow anybody to buy any chips there. So, the drains weren't right or whatever it was. So I'm concerned, this is right. I'd like us to prove that we can operate commercially. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for your comments. Councillor Joshi.
Thank you, Chair. My question was around the EIA. It says Equality Impact Assessment. Should we say equity or should it say equality? I'm just trying to remain inclusive. And what does that actually mean for us?
What page? 46.
Whereabouts are you, Councillor Joshi?
Oh, sorry, let me.
Page 46.
Yeah, it's up there, isn't it? It's page 40. Oh, God. Oh, no, page 46, the bottom end, impact customers.
Oh, right, thank you.
Tracy?
Thank you, Chair. So in response to that question, Councillor Britty, it should say equality impact assessment rather than equity, and it is to refer to the non-protected characteristics of customers and residents to whom we're providing services, and ensuring that in the provision of that service and the provision levied as a charge or indeed subsidised or free of charge, we're not disadvantaging any residents in the course of that activity.
Okay.
Thank you. Councillor Hack, will you switch your microphone off, please? If you can. Broken. No worries. Thank you. Councillor Mrs. Kaufman.
Thank you. Page 47, table 1, I got quite excited that you're actually repurposing the toilets. Can we not sort of be told that there's still going to be toilets? I know that some toilets have been turned into cafes or restaurants. We could do that. But I think with one condition, that whoever is the lessee allows the public to use the toilets. So in effect, there'll still be public toilets, but they'll be turned into something a bit more commercial. So if we could look into that as well. Thank you.
You want to, Tracy?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Kaufman. We'll take that on board and I'll forward that to the project manager. I would also just like to make the link with the agenda item later in agenda packs. It was issued as a supplementary paper, or an additional paper, should I say. So it's agenda item 12, and on page 6 of that report, there is a proposal to create an earmark reserve of £10,000 to undertake a feasibility study that will consider the refurbishment and reopening of public convenience sites across the borough. So I just want to make that link with that one, and potentially a little bit overlap with this project. I'll take that on board.
Thank you, Tracy. Councillor Hack.
Thank you, Chair. Again, no problem with the 4 principles, but I am too concerned about where we're heading and the lack of detail in this report and some of the income generating ideas that we had back in November. We had some excellent ideas from staff, from members, and I think in this report, the ideas I've seen didn't really excite me that much. For example, the MOT testing, it says it could make 21,000 per year profit, but it doesn't give us any details as to what investment would be needed for that. And if the investment outweighs, if it's in hundreds of thousands, it's pointless making £21,000 a year profit. So it needs a bit more detail. The other one I picked up is the events management and asset review. Again, it lacks details. We don't know what we're talking, just short term, small assets, all, you know, across the board? What does it involve? What income is it going to generate? We need all those details before we can make our mind up. And going back to what was proposed then, there were some excellent ideas which needed minimal amount of work and could have generated healthy amount of income, and I haven't seen any of those here. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comment, Tracy?
We'll take that away, Councillor Hack, and we'll report back to you in the next report with the detail of the other items.
Thank you. Councillor Allen?
Thank you, Chair. The question I'd like to ask, and I'd like to know, when you set your charges, in terms of energy, and obviously we know fuel prices are going up, electricity is going up, it's just going to get horrendous. How do you incorporate that in your charge? That's something I'd like to know, please.
So I think that's a really interesting question around how we do that currently. Perhaps ask our finance manager to comment in a moment on how we've done that in the past year. Rachel only joined us around last September, but Rachel will be able to give us a bit of information around that. In terms of best practice, how we should determine that is looking at incorporating, where possible, some amount of forecasting. So there are specific government forecasts around the price of oil, the price of materials that we can rely on in terms of OBR forecasts, budget responsibility forecasts. So it's about looking at kind of what is the best forecast out there and then incorporating that into our internal forecasts, and then again looking at capturing that out and bearing that in mind in terms of fees and charges. And Rachel, can I just ask you to outline your knowledge of what has happened over the last year in terms of the current approach?
To be honest, Tracy, I've actually really joined in later on in the stage, so I wasn't actually involved. So I mean, that's something I can take away, and I will come back to you when I discuss it with the head of service. But I haven't been involved in it yet, but I'll come back.
And just off the back of that question, in terms of how you incorporate the price of energy into your charges, I would also like to know what would be the upper limit of what we would charge. This is we're at the bottom end of the scale, 1.5 mil. I'd like to know, forecasted, what would be the upper range, and what would the charges look like at the higher end of the spectrum as well. I'd like to see that as well.
Yes, it would be nice to see what potential there is. It may be a figure that you possibly can't put a number on, but...
It is, I'm afraid, Chair. I mean, so what you'd be asking there would be for a full assessment on a trading account basis for every single fee and charge generating area this council does. And if you've seen the fees and charges booklet, which is about that big, that is a huge amount of work. And in my presentation, I referred to as looking at some of our top income generating areas and starting to do that work over the summer, bring those forward in the autumn as part of budget setting, and then repeating it until we've almost got a full set, keep going basically, looking at that assessment. I'm more than happy to look at an individual area for you. That is part of the plan already, to bring that back to the September PFD. So if I can, Chair, be allowed to progress with that work, I think that will give you some answers and some indication, on those top income generating areas, what charges could we levy and what, if there is any gap, if you can extrapolate that out to the 1.5 million reasonably, where might that put you?
Thank you. Councillor Bentley.
Thank you, Chair. Just a few questions on the current status of the new income stream concept. We've got small assets disposal implementation underway. So we're looking at selling redundant equipment. What sort of redundant equipment and how we're going to sell it? How is it being advertised? Are we having a yard sale outside? Selling the gold and silver in the cabinets and down in the bunker? Just what sort of equipment are we selling? And how are we going to make sure that who we sell it to doesn't have any cutbacks on us? Is it printers or computers or just tables and chairs? I'd just like a little bit more, seeing as its implementation is on the way, I'd just like to know a little bit more about it. We've also got cemeteries, purchasing advance proposal now in place. I think that's purchasing a burial plot or...
Yeah.
But we've always had that in place. So, and it's already implemented. And it's a very short, how can I say this, short-sighted thing because we've not got much space left in the cemeteries. So what's the proposed income from that and when is it going to stop? Are we going to increase the sizes of the cemeteries, move the cemeteries? It just seems a bit, purchase and advance proposals now in place and implemented, so not much detail there. For something I always thought was in there. I was looking at this quite a few years ago. Something else. I'll leave it there, Chair. I've forgotten.
You can always come back. Councillor David Lloydell. Kevin Lloydell.
Thank you very much. I find this quite exhilarating and exciting that we've now started to look at very seriously about the income streams following some bad experiences that's already been alluded to. It's not a criticism of anybody, it's just that's how it happens. So the principles there are very good. Firstly, those people who are entrepreneurs in business and everything else will do a lot of research into how other businesses work within that same area. What do they do? How do they do it? What processes do they use, etc. That's something that in the past has never been very good. Let's be fair, not very good. Through that, we've lost business. I do know that because I was trying to process something and get some usage in a particular building, but the bureaucracy stopped it from happening, so we lost, I would suggest, at least £6,000 a year. That's no fault of the people, it was because the process was so bureaucratic. I had to get the chief executive involved to step in, to stop it, and to get the process changed so that these businesses can use it satisfactorily. That's issue. So that's not a criticism, which is something that we need to take on board. It's how you let those assets, how you use those assets, how easy is the impact on the customer to say, I can book that place and it's relatively straightforward. At the moment, it's not straightforward. It's very complicated. Therefore, the business that I had, I've moved it somewhere else because it's not complicated. And we're now using another venue. That's not what we're about, which is sport and home. So hopefully that you look at those processes, look at the things that the obstacles that are there at the moment, which make it harder for people, for the customers to get access to. I'm sure I think this is going to be great. And really have the right mindset in place that will do that and make things more accessible for people who want to use it. But I welcome those suggestions. I think that we should embrace it and move forward and support it. The thing that I find, on page 47 on table 1.
What does B mean?
Where somebody says, oh, there's an income, and there's an income of like 21,000, can we not do that? It's no expenditure. So we don't know what the expenditure would be. We put income in before we put any other thing in it, and then additionally, we failed to reach that target that's already printed. So please, don't print it. Wait till you've done the business plan, done your research, then look at your income and expenditure, and then you can produce something that says, if we do it like this, this is potential income. That is the best way of doing it, rather than put figures in, which then it's going to expose something, because if it doesn't get reached, we're going to start saying, it's your fault. That ain't what it's all about, is it? We need that information quite clearly before
we can vote on anything and say, yes, that's a way forward, let's support it. I'll just share that with you, because I think that's important. Thank you.
Tracy?
Thank you, Chair. So just on to Councillor Lloyd first. Thank you for your point around market research. I think that's really important. We'll take that away in terms of that holistic approach when we are delivering commercial services. And you're absolutely right in terms of commercial mindset and bureaucratic processes. We do need to improve our processes. One of the things that I'm doing going forward for the next year or so is reviewing our financial procedurals. And if this council is going to have more of a commercial mindset and more of a commercial approach, those processes that you, and some of them being bureaucratic, you know, will need to be looked at, and our financial procedure rules reviewed in light of that. I think just to be clear on the table that's set out, table 1, this is just intended to be a snapshot. We're not asking members to make any decisions on these at this stage. It's intended to be a snapshot and a full business case that is, if there's a status for those items where it says full business case under development. What we're proposing to do is come back to you with the full and complete details around all of those 5 concepts that we are looking to work up to full business case stage. Councillor Bentley, on your specific points about selling redundant equipment and cemeteries, I'm going to hand over to John now. John has been leading the internal line for the GAP project, managing all of these areas. John can give you some more detail on that, if he's got a microphone.
Microphones, to apologise. So, as Tracy's alluded to under there, that table 1, to give you clarity that actually we're looking at these, we haven't yet got all the detail that we require, but we'll bring that back. Small asset disposals are simply redundant equipment. So, for example, Council Cornwall mentioned about pest control. So, a lot of old kit usually associated with us operating a pest control service, which is sitting doing anything that actually has a resale value. So we've got a draft policy around how we're looking at selling and moving those on. At the moment, what we're doing is compiling a list of what we've got. Clearly, be aware there's other IT equipment as a part of the transition we moved away. So they're looking at exploring that as well. So when it's a small asset disposals, it is really minimal value in terms of looking at hundreds of 50s. But we've not actually disposed of them yet, but what we are doing is compiling a list as part of getting all that information together. And I'm happy to share that as it comes forward in terms of some of the ideas and suggestions, but also some of the areas, so you've got that information. And the cemeteries, you're right, in part it was in place, but in part it wasn't. And I think it was felt it was an operational decision as actually just doing the work as we should be doing it, making these decisions and changes in the way we operate. I can provide you with more detail, but I remember it was somewhere in the region of £15,000 income additional each year. But yes, you're right, there is only a certain life left in these facilities, and we've got to explore future options for that going forward. So hopefully that clarifies a few of those bits. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wells. Councillor Bolter.
Thank you, yes. What we must remember, a lot of our prices are fixed by statute. Every year we have a list of things, what we can increase, what we can't increase, and 2/3 of them we can't increase anyway, because it's fixed by statute. We can't charge more than that. Some of the planning things, it's fixed, we can't charge more. The service might cost us more, we can't charge any more for that service. So that's one thing to bear in mind. The other thing is we also compare our prices with neighbouring authorities to make sure we're in keeping with the other authorities. We're not out of step by charging too little or too much. So that's the thing we always do as well. I know when the peer group came, so we don't charge enough for this, that and the other. Well, we've compared these things with all authorities and we're comparable. Now, if we charge more for our services, Blaby does, people go to Blaby, won't come to us. Years ago, we used to do the slaughterman's licence. People came all over the country to buy our slaughterman's licence because we were cheaper than anybody else. That raised an awful lot of money for this authority. We don't do that anymore. Don't know why it was stopped, but I don't know. I might know the answer for that because I think he was around at the time. But things like that is a rarity that we could well pick up and charge authorities the pleasure of us doing. So it's not things in front of you we need to think about. It's things outside what we normally do, we can actually, they will charge for. And being a businessman, I always say we should charge whatever the market will bear. And that's the important point. No point overcharging, no point undercharging. It's what the market will bear, is what we charge. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor David Lloyd.
Thank you, Chair. It's just to bring back the point to the business plans, and as we're looking at this commercial mindset, commercial revenue streams, the reason that we may have failed in the past is that, as most councils market, we get the marketing plan completely wrong. And I just want to be assured that part of these business cases that we're going to be creating is a full marketing plan, such as the future costs of any additional members of staff. If we get the marketing right and these revenue streams take off, we will have to have a future person, an SEO specialist, a social media specialist, whatever it might be, but they be a part of the business cases, just so we can prove that we are at least trying to be competitive in the commercial world.
Thank you. Councillor Hack.
Thank you, Chair. My point is along the similar lines of Councillor Bolter and Councillor Lloydell, that do we carry out any market research to assess the gap in the market in terms of services, in terms of what demands exist out there? That's not just providing services for our resident, but to the resident across the whole of Leicestershire, or, as was mentioned by Councillor Bolter, the whole country, possibly. And do we also consider outsourcing as well our services? Whatever we do best, do we outsource any of the services? Do we do that research? All of that needs to be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you. I think last speaker, Councillor Geoffrey Kaufman.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the problems whenever we've provided a service seems to be this magical thing. The treasurers, that's what they used to be called. At the time, you used to put on it, and in my day, it was called central costs. So we could come up with a business plan, and somebody magicked up a central cost. And I don't know how they allocated it, but I'm sure you, through the computer, can allocate it differently. But that stymied everything that we had. So if you start charging costs for the chief executive's office, I suppose, and perhaps that's the reason why our rat catcher lost money. We put too much on central costs. That is, if we can overcome that and make sure that we don't load them with too many costs. And the other thing is, I understand there's a good business in taxi licensing. I think there's one local authority, is it Walsall or somewhere up in the West Midlands, that's making a really good earner, and it appears that taxi licensing all over the country that have no affinity at all with that local authority, and seems to be getting in. Can we look at, it was Bill that mentioned what are joining authorities, but you'll look around and you'll see, I think it is Walsall, all the taxis that are nowhere near Walsall seem to be coining it. Can we find out how they manage it? Thank you.
Thank you. I think you'll find it's Wolverhampton.
It's what?
Wolverhampton.
That's the one.
Thank you.
They got a football team.
Councillor Lloydell. Kevin.
I do appreciate this. I'm going to talk about the cemeteries very, very quickly, very briefly, and the purchase in advance. Some people may remember, on the board behind you, Chair, is Peter Upton. Now, Peter was on this council for several years. He was an excellent councillor. A personal friend, and his wife, Owen, who was a councillor in her own right. Both became councillors, and became personal friends. They purchased their plots years in advance. Over dinner, Owen was to say, Peter's going to go first, because I don't want to lay on top of him. But it's been in place. I just want to share that with you, because I thought it was quite funny.
But tourists as well. Why not?
Thank you. We'll let you know. Okay, there are no more speakers. I think there's general agreement over the principles, Tracy. I think there's been enough feedback for you to go away, and clearly there's a lot of detail that members would like to see about some of the 5 implementations. One that's already implemented, but a further bit of work on that, please. So the recommendation is the content of the report be noted and that feedback is provided. I see a show of hands of confirmation. Unanimous, thank you. Agenda item 11, and approval of housing policies. Chris Eyre.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everybody. As the report highlights, the housing team are reviewing their housing policies with a view to updating or rewriting their policies if they are not compliant or don't meet with existing legislation or regulation or guidance. First of 3 policies to come to committee are those attached in the report as Appendix 1, 2 and 3. These policies, if adopted or when adopted, will be the foundation for the team to deliver that service area. It will also help form part of their performance management structure and open up transparency and accountability for tenants accessing those service areas. Happy to take any questions on those.
Thank you, Mr. I'd love to know who Tenant C is. That was quite an interesting response from Tenant C. Not happy with anything, it would seem. Councillor Bolter.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, these policies are most people will get through this evening. Happy with A and B, I've got no problem with those 2 reports. C, I've got a little query over. We don't do a means test for aids and adaptations of housing. In the private sector, there's a means test. We don't do that. What do other councils do in the area? Do they charge do a means test for these things or not? I'm just concerned about housing revenue account in future years. Some of these things are quite expensive. I know the children's comes anyway, I'm not worried about the children's one. It's the adult ones that are a problem. When you start putting extensions on buildings, and we've got one big one coming up which will be £40,000 or thereabouts, you know, it's a big hole in the housing revenue account. We see if some way we can claw that back if it's possible.
Chair, if I can answer that. First of all, the local authorities in Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, and in fact probably most of the East Midlands don't do a means test for adaptations to council-owned properties. As you rightly pointed out, it's funded through the HRA. The reason for that is obviously we're trying to meet the needs of vulnerable tenants who are in the greatest need. A high percentage of our tenants are on low incomes. And in fact, for last year, of the 13 major adaptations that were received by the council, 12 of those were confirmed as being on pension credits or universal credit. So whilst there may be 1 or 2 people in the course of a period that may have some income or disposable income, it just the administration of that could be quite labour intensive. I'm not aware of any local authority that I could point to that does a means test, although I have heard of 1 or 2 in the south of England that's means tested, but I couldn't point you in that direction. It was a while ago when I picked up on this. I think, did you have...
That's the point, Joe. I'm just trying to make sure that we're not out of step with anybody else in the area. I understand that we're the lowest provider of housing, if you like, on the bottom of the rung. I understand our residents are on benefits and various kinds. I think when the allocation policy comes before us, we may have something to look at on that one, so that people don't have our properties, actually have properties abroad. So that's for the future. Now Mr Ayres has mentioned, has clarified that point, I'm happy to move the item C as well, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Bolter. Councillor Hack.
Well, thank you, Chair. Just a quick question. Now that it's been mentioned that it's not means tested, at the time of allocation, do we ask the potential candidates for our housing list whether they have any assets abroad, or is it just based on what they have in this country?
Chair, I think there's definitely a question about their income and the level of income, and we make an assessment of whether they can afford private rent. I don't recall seeing anything in the allocations policy about assets, but that is something, the allocations policy is in the next tranche of policies to be reviewed. And I'm hoping to get the allocations policy out for consultation over the summer and back to committee in September. And that will be one of the key areas that we'll address in the policy.
Councillor Allen.
Thank you, Chair. I just want a bit of clarity on the protocol when a tenant is in arrears. On page 55, you've got point 6, which is taken to court. And then on page 56.7, how we can help. Which way does that go? Do we go for how can we help first and then go to court action, or do we go court action first and then how we can help? Because I do feel that we are going to get a lot of people this year that are going to fall short on their rents, and we have to be in a position where we can support people out there. And I'm just going to link that to where you've made a point on point 11, page 57, which is vulnerable tenants and the definition of vulnerable. Should we not work with social services to actually know what is a vulnerable person and how we can help, and then maybe whether or not court action is required? I just want to know the process of that. Thank you.
Okay, first and foremost, it's about prevention. So, and court action, we try and avoid that. So there's a lot of intense work, not only from the rental income team, but also the finance team, the housing benefits team. We do a lot of work, intensive work, trying to engage with people. We refer them to Helping Hands, so there's links in with support groups. I suppose that taking the legal remedy is the last option that we take. But obviously there does come a point, particularly if people aren't engaging with us or aren't accessing that support that's made available to them, then there will be times we have to go through the court process. Going through the court process, again, it's a bit complicated, but it's very rare that a judge will grant on first presentation an eviction anyway. There is a mechanism built in place where they look at getting a tenant to make repayments plus their rent. So there's a lot of fail-safes even when we get to the court stage. So there's lots of things that could happen as an intervention at that stage.
So at what point do we identify somebody as vulnerable before we take them to court?
Vulnerability is assessed very early on. So when there are arrears, our officers will be speaking to people. So, for example, there's one today that's pinged up. They've come to us as not relating to their rent initially. It was an estate management issue, but it quickly became clear that they were in financial difficulty because the officers will check their rent account. So whilst they're going out to see about the estate management issue, they start picking up on this, or we've noticed your rent accounts in arrears. Are you okay? You know, are you struggling with that? And then what happens is, once we've picked up that there's an issue there, a vulnerability, the income team are informed of that, and then they will make contact and have those discussions. We've also got, I forget the officer's name, Chetna, who does a lot of work. Maybe you could just explain about the work.
Yes.
Mr. House?
In revenues and benefits, we've got the financial inclusion officer. So if Chris's team come across somebody that is struggling, then they can refer them to that financial inclusion officer. She'll work closely with them, look at maximising their benefits, look at what they've got coming in and going out, and any budgeting help they might need, look at who else she can refer them to for additional support. So there is a lot of work done, and it's not just referrals from Chris's team. We get these from outside of the council coming to us through Helping Hands, through others. So that financial inclusion officer will do an awful lot of work with people to try and help as much as we possibly can, because as Chris says, we're looking at prevention. We don't want to get to that stage, because once we do, it's additional costs for somebody that is clearly already struggling. So the more we can put in place to start with, the better.
Thank you. Mr. Ball?
Yeah, just to add to what Mr. House has said, and gives you any further assurance, Councillor Allen, before any proceedings are ever put into court, the council is required to follow certain pre-action rules known as protocols. There is one specifically which applies to possession claims or recovery of debts by social landlords. And that protocol sets out exhaustively the steps that Mr. House has taken, which they have to follow, or the council risks costs being made against it for the claim to be struck out or to be deferred until those steps have been taken. And I can assure you, no claim will be put into court until people have been satisfied that the protocol has been adhered to fully, because it's not our position to put the council in a prejudicial cost position.
Thank you, Mr. Ball. Okay, Councillor Bolter has moved recommendations A, B and C, income management, recharge and age and adaptations. I'll second it. All those in favour? Again, that's unanimous, thank you. Agenda item 12, get it on. Budget monitoring, Rashpal.
Thank you, Chair. So this report confirms the overall council outturn position for last year, subject to the audit on the accounts completing, I guess, so which is scheduled on later for this year. It also seeks approval from the committee to create 2 new reserves on the surface achieved. I just touched on that a bit earlier about the 10k and the 140k, and on the general fund. I'm going to give a high-level overview on the outturn position for the last year. I will then hand over to Tracy to summarise before you have any questions, if that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So going to chart 1 on page 5 of the report, it very nicely summarises the outturn of the year. You can see that on both the revenue accounts, the general fund and the housing revenue account, a balanced budget was planned. The general fund has delivered a 315,000 surplus, which were the main reasons for this set out on the table at the top of page 6. The movement between the forecast outturn at Q3 is 474,000, which shows we need to make some improvements to our budget, but also forecasting throughout the year. On the HRA, the deficit is 179,000, which, although was unbudgeted, was foreseen in Q3. The main reasons for this are set out on page 12, which shows the big adverse movements for the year in respect of the area depreciation and the largest favourable movement being in relation to the interest table on capital charges. On capital, the general fund programme has seen the majority of its budget slip into the new financial year. This is largely because of the significant schemes to move to block sales and the housing development. Well, that's just two of the examples, to be honest. And similarly, HRA slippage relates to works moving into 22-23, namely fire safety and window replacements. I will now hand over to Tracy.
Okay. Thank you. So I suppose I'm aware that this outturn report on the general fund in particular reports a surplus that was unplanned, and I think the report seeks to recognise that and explain the reasons for that. And overall, the main reason for the surplus over the year on the general fund is the unutilised COVID provision, of which a £500,000 budget provision was put in place, and £386,000 of that COVID provision was not utilised in the year. That budget was put in as a precautionary measure to assist the council in funding any unforeseen COVID-related costs throughout the year, and those costs have just quite simply not come to fruition. Throughout the year, some of those amounts have been reported and released, but towards the end of the year, further funding was released. And so what you can see before you this evening is a bit of a jump from Q3 to Q4 outturn, and the table at the beginning of the report sets out the movements. There are movements in other areas and some releases. I think clearly overall, this council does need to improve its budgeting and its forecasting, and that is going to take certainly some time over the coming year to work with service areas to revise that financial management approach. And section 7 of the report sets out some work that we're taking forward to improve that financial management approach. And I think that's the takeaway really in terms of those improvements that are required. And what I will say is that it's not unusual for councils to be in this position in terms of financial management, and that's why SIPFA in the last couple of years have introduced a financial management code for which all councils have been required to adopt from last April. And that code sets out certain requirements for local authorities in terms of financial management, and we are required to comply or explain. So currently I'm working with a team, I'm undertaking a self-assessment against that code to identify areas where we don't currently comply, and we're putting an action plan together that we're taking forward to implement some improvements to ensure that we do comply. So I think just a couple of bullet points just around some of those improvements, but are detailed in the report. We're looking at undertaking a skills and competency assessment and training for budget holders. We're looking at a training and needs analysis within the finance service. You'll all know, given the LGA financial health check last year and the corporate peer review earlier this year, that finance team resources have been an issue here. And I'm now pleased to say that we are starting to get some stability in the team. We've now got a complete set of finance business partners due to start over the coming months. We've got Rash Powell in post, who's doing a very good job in providing that stability in the team also. I think it tells a story in terms of where the council has been during the pandemic and in the recent months. So I think just on that point, further progress updates will be provided as part of the standard quarterly monitoring reports. I think on this issue it is very important that we keep talking to you about the improvements that we're taking forward, because it does link to the information that we presented in terms of financial outcome and the impact that it has for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. I've got no hands up, so I shall go first. I have got several hands up now, but I will go first anyway. And I'm going to play the newbie card. I'm looking at page 11, the housing revenue account. I've tried to do the maths on this several times. I thought if something was in brackets, it was a surplus. Is that correct? Anybody?
Yes, it is.
Right. I'm looking at the end column of variance, and my figures come to a completely different conclusion to the 179 deficit. Because the first figure on the housing revenue account, I would have thought the 286 should be in brackets as a plus, but it's been included, I think, as a minus, and it alters the final figure hugely. Am I wrong? Please tell me if I am wrong.
Looks like we're just crunching the numbers, Chair.
Yeah, that's why.
If it's on the spend.
We continue to look at that matter, Chair.
Yes, but I would like an answer to no.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Councillor Kevin Lovell.
That's right, yeah. We've been here before, and it's just something that we look into the future and how we monitor the budgets and how we can get back to some sort of partnership with members and officers, especially from a finance point of view. When we look at page 7 and the general table 2, and the overspends on particularly law and democracy and then build, which is quite substantial. It's the only reason I've done research on that and understand why that's there, because of vacancies and so on. I'm only picking those out because they're there. What I'm saying is in the future we used to be in a position where who actually makes that decision that they're going to go overspend by that amount. If the budget's set, we set the budget, it runs along, you get updates, you don't get any input with regards to going above what has already been agreed. So therefore, it's a fait accompli. We're told that we're overspending. Not necessarily reasons why that is. Should there not be some sort of partnership in the future with regards to, if it's just the chair of the finance or something to say, look, previously we look as though we're going to be overspending, the reason for that is X, Y, Z. So we're all clear that we're not sitting in meetings saying, why are you overspent? And you have to justify it because of various activities that have taken place, unforeseen circumstances, etc. I understand some of the circumstances. We're going to move forward now, aren't we? Not backwards. This is 21, 22. So we have some more partnership in depth working with us so that we can support each other going forward, especially to avoid overspends of this magnitude. So I'll just share that with you.
Tracy?
May I respond to that, Chair? I mean, just taking the example of law and democracy, on the following page, on page 8, under 4.6, it does set out the reasons for that around selective licensing, which I think has been, in terms of telling the story, that's been part of the journey of the last year, hasn't it? And certainly we'll take that on board. I think one of the things I would like to see in terms of, potential forecast overspends is for at the outset of those being reported that we're coming to committee, setting out the actions that we're undertaking to stabilise particular expenditure or particular, performance on income. And I think that's really important that we convey to you what action we're taking to basically stabilise things.
Appreciate that, Chair. Thank you.
Councillor David Lewell.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted just a clarification on page 6, the table at the top. The figures listed in the items 1 to 7, are they savings that we've made on page 6? There would be a question if they are, then there'll be a further question.
Apologies, Councillor Roller. Which figure?
It's just the table at the top, so page 6. Are they the savings that we've made? Or So we're talking about things like savings due to council not directly making support payments to the leisure services.
Yes, they are. There are savings that have been made throughout the year. They have been reported towards the end of the year rather than updating members throughout the year. And again, this links back to some of the improvements required around our forecasting techniques in terms of sharing those throughout the year when we forecast them.
So this is where the supplementary comes in, is with the leisure services, and I'm guessing it has to do with the leisure services contract, what's to stop them from coming after that, or is there anything to do with that? Stopping them from coming after that at a later date.
Sure.
And the car park income, where we've had additional money coming in from that, and this is not a criticism in any way, this is just because we have been called short with selective licensing, is has that money been accounted for properly, i.e. is that money in the right years that it is to do with, as opposed to taking it front loaded.
If I may, sorry. So in terms of your first question on SLM, I've been quite close to this. The 75k is actually services we ask as a council from SLM, so it's not something they can come back to us. We just didn't do them last year, so that's more of our budget, just saving in that sense. In future, we probably will use that, but at the moment we haven't. And moving on to the car park income, I can assure you we have the little counting right in the right years, and yeah, it's not front loaded for sure.
Thank you. Councillor Hack.
Thank you, Chair. That was the question I was going to ask regarding the car parking income. Are we likely to achieve the same level of income what we have seen since we implemented the charges? We're not going to have the same situation as selective licensing, that year down the line we have to completely revise our budget and say, okay, we've got to find this money. I'm actually quite pleased to see that we are in a situation where we've got an underspent rather than an overspent. I'd much rather be in the position where we've got an underspent rather than an overspent. Clearly, we've got some work to do in terms of our forecasting, budget forecasting, and the way how we monitor the variances between the actual budget and the budget forecast. But as we are by law, we have to balance our budget every year. We can't allocate our overspent to next year. I think I'd much rather be in a position, like I said, that we have an underspent than an overspent. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Allen.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got quite a simple question, and that is, in terms of forecasting, are we running into reserves over time? We, about a year ago, I think this is during COVID, we made some very, very tough decisions based on a forecast that was delivered to us with regards to going into our reserves. And when I look at these figures and I see that there are underspends, and then I cross-reference that to money that we haven't, or targets that we haven't met with selective licensing, car parking. I'm just trying to work out, and you've said it quite transparently there, Tracy, that we've got to work on our forecast, but we made some tough decisions. And I just want to say, is that true, that we are still running into reserves if we do not make those decisions?
Tracy.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a really important question to ask. Given the outlook that we face this year in terms of an inflation crisis for councils, and it is an inflation crisis that we're facing, even if we didn't face the financial challenges to do with funding in local government, the inflation crisis alone, I think, puts this council at risk. So that is one consideration. We then are looking to the future around funding reforms, so fair funding, which is now called Needs and Resources, the potential that we may well see some of the funding that we get to keep Currently, we may see that reduce. We don't get much grant funding, but we do get a little bit, and we also that also plays into how much business rates we get to retain. And there are also planned changes to business rates. Now, the government haven't set the date for these. They've been kicked back for quite a long time now, but they will change the funding for this council as they will all councils. And the likelihood is we will get to retain less funding going forward. The latest version of the medium-term financial plan was approved at council in February. That set out deficits over the forthcoming 5-year period. We are reviewing that medium-term financial plan. Clearly, as a new Section 151 officer, I would like to do that work myself. We're doing that as part of a new medium-term financial strategy. Having done some early work on the medium-term financial plan, I at this stage would say that those deficits will bear true. And on that basis, the decisions that have been taken in terms of income generation from, again, as a CFO, they have been in the best interest of the authority in terms of its financial sustainability on an ongoing basis. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, if I can just ask, on cost of living and inflation pressures, the council is undertaking a senior leadership team are undertaking an impact assessment currently. We need to pick it up with the chief executive about how we share that with you, but obviously I'm assuming it will be of key interest to members, and we'll probably look to share that informally before we bring it later on to perhaps PFD as part of the Q1 report for this financial year. But looking forward to Q1, when we present this version of the report for Q1 of this year, I am expecting to be reporting some forecast increases in terms of things that are starting to hit us, such as, of course, energy inflation, like it is everyone at home, but other areas that are impacting us in terms of cost pressures.
Thank you, Tracy. I think in terms of car park income, through the members' bulletin, we've seen how remarkably steady it has been since January the 4th when it was implemented. And that income stream, I don't see that changing much at all.
No, Chair, apologies, Councillor, we didn't respond to that point, but Council, car parking income, there is an increase, the exact figure escapes me, but we have seen an increase forecast for this financial year compared to last financial year, and we don't expect that to suffer the forecast as they are currently.
Thank you. Councillor Bolter.
Thank you, Chair. Budget setting is always a very difficult thing. Officers present to us what they think the council needs to run the services for the following year. It's a guesswork. We've got a crystal ball to look into it and think what grants we're going to get or not get, but their main job is to make sure we don't run at a deficit, instead of a negative budget. So I'm very pleased that we've got in the black, not the red. They are very cautious. They did warn us that things are going to get worse, and the peer group also, when they came, said things are going to get worse for local authorities. So we need to generate as much income as we can to get a bit of wool on our backs before we actually suffer the frost which will start to come in the next few years. So I'm pleased with the report. I think officers are doing a very good job. And I think that looking forward, okay, we need to get a bit more accurate with some of our figures, but they're on the right side. I'll sooner go this way than the other, and then have to put an extra budget forward halfway through the year, which many authorities have had to do. And so I'm happy with this report. Okay, things have got to happen, but I'm happy going forward. But I'm interested in the housing revenue account. I never run at a loss. And I speak to Mr. Eyre every year, coming to Christmas, making sure the budget is on target and not in deficit. And we take measures for it coming a little bit close. So I was amazed when I saw this paper this afternoon, because I didn't get one through the post. Tracy sent me one this afternoon. So I looked at that and I thought, Mr. Eyre's going to have some questions to me tonight. So please explain your situation.
Tracy? Chris?
Thank you. If I can, Councillor Bolter, my colleague Rashpal is quickly looking at the numbers based on Councillor Charlesworth's original question. What we can tell you is the figures are wrong that are presented in the report. They are presented as a deficit. We are looking at a surplus position. However, I do not want to divulge any figures at the moment because I believe that we need to go back and we need to test this position. Obviously, this is quite a situation that I think I would like to go away and test, please, Chair, before we finalise the housing revenue account.
You can do, but I will give you my figures because mine is a surplus of 523,000. You, of course, need to go away, check that, verify it, but clearly there's been an error here. I don't know whether there's been a deficit before. I'd like to say, first time on this committee. Councillor Bolter knows all about housing revenue accounts. I wasn't surprised by the deficit, I was surprised by the numbers. So, anyway, Councillor Lloydell.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think it's important to remember Councillor Hack has made a very, very pertinent point about the statutory requirement for local authorities to balance the books. I think it's important to remember that as chair of the audit committee, and the audit was, committee was last week, scrutiny of all those services and what's happening is quite rigorous. And it's moving in the right direction. But the statutory requirement to balance the books, I'll just give you a quote from my colleague in Blaby District Council, my counterpart who sits on a particular committee. He's on record as saying that used car parking, because that was in the Mercury, they're putting their charges up from 30p to £1. The reason they're doing that is because they've got to balance the books. That's important, because you have a statutory requirement to do that. I'm not criticising them in shape or form, good at all. But the important comment was they've got to balance the books, that's why they're putting it up. And I think that from what we see here, we are moving in the right direction. What our auditors and our own internal auditors are doing, I think they're doing a reasonable job, which can be reported back because there's a meeting next week to finalise at the end of the But again, I congratulate everybody that's done this, working with this under very, very difficult times, and circumstances if you think it's trying to achieve, and especially staffing, people leaving, people sick, and so on. So I think we are moving in the right direction. I commend the report, obviously with the exception of the housing one, of course, to two members, and hopefully again working in partnership, working in a different era, moving forward. I think we've got a reasonable future ahead of us. The only downside, of course, is the external pressures, which we haven't got control over. Every time we have it's balancing the books, but equally you need to have a 3-year or 5-year plan. No authority can do that. You need to have the Police and Crime Commission do that because it's on an annual basis and you don't know what you're going to get from one year to another. Last year, the Police and Crime Commission cut 100 police officers from the budget because they weren't getting the income in to pay for it. Well, no, that's wrong. They've got the income to pay for it. We're still paying for 257 police officers. Still paying for 257 because they didn't balance the books weren't being balanced. So that's the levelling up is levelling up. That doesn't happen. That's not happening. That's just completely. It's important to remember balancing the book is the priority. The external auditors penalise us quite greatly if we didn't do that. I'm sure everybody would to make sure that doesn't happen as a problem.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? No?
Thank you, Chair. If I may just comment, just referencing external audit there, I think just to make the link there that external audit do report on significant risks for the council. In terms of finalising their audit for the 2021 financial year, they're presenting their audit findings report to the audit committee next Monday. However, their audit is still not complete. They need to undertake what they call the value for money audit. which is a separate requirement of audit, and that will look at our financial sustainability. So obviously just invite members to keep an eye on that and watching brief as that progresses, and the auditors report to us finally in October, hopefully with the outcome of that work. So just making that link there, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, there are no more speakers. There are two recommendations here. B, I think we've got no trouble with, the 140k and the 10,000. A is that the contents of the report and appendix be noted, but there is this question about the figures in the housing revenue account. Do I need an amendment, Sam, or just Okay, so if Tracy can take that item away and come back to the committee when you've sorted it through. Okay, so the recommendations are A and B. All those in favour? That's unanimous, thank you.
Can I just request a quick comfort break?
We shall adjourn for a few minutes. Okay, thank you.
Oh, I had it.
Recommence. And we're on our agenda item 13, please. COVID-19 additional relief fund policy, and it's John House, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so a COVID additional relief fund. I'm going to call it CAR for duration. It'll save a lot of time. This was announced in March, and we have got £985,000 to distribute to businesses that have been adversely affected by the pandemic. There are some restrictions on how we can do that. We can't give it to anybody that's already been awarded extended retail discount or the nursery discount, and we can't award it for any unoccupied periods. And the final point is that we've got to target this fund at businesses that have been adversely affected by the pandemic. So what we're proposing to do to distribute this fund to the businesses that need it is cut the business rates caseload down. So we've started with around 1,400 businesses. Out of that, we need to strip anybody that's had those supports already. We are cutting out businesses or where councils are the rival party. We've taken those out of the list. And what we're looking to do is ask people to opt in to this scheme. So they will make a declaration that they have been adversely affected. They haven't been able to cope with the pressures of the pandemic. They haven't been able to keep that income coming into the same level. And there's also a subsidy question that they have to declare that they haven't had over subsidy limits in the financial year 21-22. At the end of that window, and we're hoping to run this for 6 weeks, at the end of that window, we close it and we assess how many applications we've got, what the net liability is for them, and decide then how much is awarded to them. Now, in terms of how that's awarded, sorry, Councillor.
No, sorry.
Please finish.
So yes, we'll wait until that window closes. We'll see what applications we've got and we'll assess how much we can award. Now that award is not a grant, it's not cash paid to these businesses, it is a reduction in their business rates liability for the year 21-22. That reduces the risk of fraudulent applications because it is simply a drop in what they're required to pay. Trying to estimate what might come in, if 75% of businesses come to us and say, yes, we fit these criteria, we want to apply, we'll be able to award roughly 25% relief to each of those businesses. By doing it this way, by opening the window and assessing afterwards, we avoid the risk of overspending with this relief. We can't go over that 985. If we spend less, we have to give that back. We've also removed some businesses, such as banks, such as petrol stations, which we feel would not go down particularly well with the general public if we were seen to be giving discounts to businesses that actually are probably doing fairly well. What I would like your thoughts, your advice on is other businesses, other types of business that we should consider removing before we go out and contact them and ask them to apply. Now, in terms of the way we do that, we're going to send a letter to each business. We're looking probably at just over 300. So we'll send letters to them. We will email where we've got email addresses. But also, because of the numbers we're talking about, we're looking to be able to call each of them as well. We want to really maximise the support that we can give to these businesses. And what we've seen across the country really is that the take-up is low for this, and the take-up can be as low as 15%. We've seen at other authorities. So we want to give every opportunity for businesses to hear about this and to apply for it. Because we want to help as much as we can, we don't want to give anything back. So we'll contact them in as many ways as possible. As I say, we'll open that window. We've got to have all of this done by the 30th of September. That ties in with the reporting of the NNDR3, and that's why we've got that deadline there. And we will receive new burdens funding for this again. Although, again, and you'll have heard this before, we don't know at what level we will get new burdens funding. We don't until much further down the line. So we're having to be careful with our spend as we deliver this. And actually, the majority can be delivered in-house with the help of the business rates team, with the exception of some software that our revenues and benefits software provider has given us. So really it's 1.3, I believe. I welcome thoughts from you all on any other areas that we really need to consider pulling out that might be sensitive or might be unsuitable.
Thank you, Mr. Oust. I racked my brain on that one. I came up with car washes, but taking a slightly different point of view than yourself, I would sooner it be fairly stringent. I know businesses need help. Sure, it's those businesses that do need help and that they have to go the extra mile to get this money, and that they deserve it. If at the end of the day we have to hand some back, then so be it. But, you know, it's the businesses that need it that need to justify it. I'm sorry if I'm sounding tough, but that's just my comment. Councillor Geoffrey Kaufman.
Yeah, I think I'm reading this rather disappointed in a way that, from personal experience over the years, I was running a business, a small business from home, which if I'd have been in business now, would have been put out of business, and I can't claim any of this because working from home, I would have been paying council tax, I suppose, and because I wasn't paying a business rate. But I've come across people who've fallen between, fallen in every hole, every way, but they're still running a business. They're self-employed. I can think of one that was put out of business for a long period of time. He comes around in a van and trains kids at boot camp or something. And I was working in our parks. We closed the parks and he couldn't happen. I don't know him, but my guess is he hasn't received anything because I assume he garaged his van at home and he's not paying business rate. I can think of somebody else that goes round and does therapy. She's based at home and doesn't get anything, and these are the people I think that have really suffered. But the regret is I don't think you can help them on that, but if there is a way you could find to help them on that, I think that's what we should be doing.
John?
Yes, thank you, and you're right. We don't have the jurisdiction, I suppose, to award any of this to anybody outside of the business rates system, which, as you rightly say, does exclude those that do not operate out of a business rate system.
Councillor Bentley.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the same lines, are we saying that only people with a business premises that we've already identified can claim some of this money? But haven't we already identified them? Or is it that only people that came forward and asked for previous money have got previous money and now we're looking to fill in the gaps?
Yes, so there have been criteria for all of the grants and all of the relief so far, and there have been gaps. There have been, particularly in warehousing, that's the first that springs to mind, that have not been eligible for any support throughout the pandemic. And I think that is the aim of CARF, is to try and fill some of those gaps. So it doesn't fill all the gaps, as Councillor Kaufman pointed out, but this does bring in a little over 300 businesses that have slipped through the gap so far, haven't had any support, and this is going to allow us to provide some to them. Again, it is businesses that do operate out of the premises, but it will allow us to cover those that haven't been supported already, and that's where we want to.
So we've already identified all those businesses?
Yes, so the software that has been provided, the software we're using, looks at our system and will look at who has already received relief, received grants, and leaves us with those that haven't. From there, we strip down further to take out anything unsuitable. But yes, we have a good idea of which businesses they are.
Just to be the devil's advocate there, Chair, not that I want to after what I've just paid to fill my fuel tank up earlier on, I had to take out a big loan. Be the devil's advocate though, if somebody from a establishment that we've said no came forward, would you be able to refuse them legally, or would it be classed as discrimination?
Take that away and I will come back to you.
I just wouldn't want this council to be accused of discriminating against anybody, which could be detrimental to this council's reputation. I understand the political aspect of it and people not wanting us to support establishments that might be making lots of money, but I just want to protect this council.
Councillor Hack.
Thank you, Chair. Questions and comments along the similar lines. You said we've already invited businesses, and I was going to ask, what about those businesses operating from home? Do we have a list of registered businesses that are operating from home? What about online businesses? Many young people now have the digital economy. Have we invited any of those? And when you talk about banks, does it include other financial institutions, or is it just the banks that are going to be excluded from the list? And one last point, multinationals, are they going to be excluded? And if they are, what about the franchises? Because often those are owned by individuals rather than the multinational itself.
John.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Councillor Hagg. So we'll take away multinationals and the franchises and have a look at that. The same with the banks and other financial institutions. A lot of it comes down to how that business is defined by the BOA when that business is rated. It will have it's called a SIC code, I believe, SIC code, which will say what type of business it is, and it's based on those codes that we look to exclude certain types. So I'll take that away and check on whether that is wider financial institutions or simply banks. And in terms of businesses operating from home, again, if they are liable for business rates, then they can be considered for this relief. But as this is prescribed as being a scheme that falls inside business rates, it doesn't look to provide any support for businesses outside of that area.
Just very quickly, Chair. Do they have to provide any evidence for loss of income or how they've suffered the financial hardship? And also on the digital economy, very quickly, please. How are you going to include the businesses that are just solely operating online?
Thank you. So the online businesses, again, I'll take away, but it's still going to come back to and depend on their business rates liability and whether they have one. In terms of evidence of loss, we've taken the same approach as we did to some of the additional restrictions grants, in that we're asking people to opt in and sign a declaration rather than look at some profit and loss accounts over the last 3 years and make that judgment ourselves as to whether they've suffered. That approach allows us to deliver this scheme without, I don't want to use the word huge, but without excessive staffing costs, administration costs. So I mentioned the 15% take-up. That was largely from councils that have had an application process and they've had the accounts to go through and they've made that judgment and it's come back at 15%. So that's the reason why we're looking to do this with an opt-in and a declaration. That has been satisfactory for previous grants, and there are many other authorities that are taking the same approach, so we won't be out on our own. Another option that we considered was an opt-out scheme. So we would have the list, and the relief would be automatically credited unless by a particular date the business had come to us and said, we don't believe that we should have this. We considered that too far in the other direction, with too much risk of making payments to businesses that didn't need it. This declaration gives us that ability to go back in the future should, I suppose, external or internal audit want to see the process and want to follow through on certain accounts, then we can go back and we'll be able to recover relief that perhaps shouldn't have been awarded.
Thank you. I've got 4 more speakers. I'm proposing to draw a line under that. Councillor Kevin Loyal.
Thank you, Chair, very quickly. On your exempt list, the 313, would you include developers in that? They've made quite a bit of money over this year. Food outlets, there's another one. Think of some of the food outlets we've got in the borough. Made a lot of profits over that period. Obviously, there's a check you can do because I've released the figures now. It's the pre-tax profits, which are now in the public domain. So any businesses that all of a sudden become millionaires, then you can exempt them straight away. Can I just confirm that we talked about one of the criteria, you have to be paying business rates, because I'm thinking of mobile hairdressers, for example. They wouldn't be paying business rates. What's the business? Pet salons. Mobile pet salons. Have you seen those? Go around and puppy dogs. They've not been supported in any way, shape or form. Small tradesmen businesses, and plumbers and builders and brickies, all those people who are working for themselves or are they exempt all of this? Have they suffered equally throughout this pandemic in some of about to claim benefits or whatever. So why would those be? Is there no way we can start looking at those small businesses that contribute a great deal to our economy, but been disenfranchised with this criteria? Sorry.
No, thank you. I'll take that away because I think it is important that we look at and consider which businesses have still fallen through the gaps. And And this relief, whilst it does cover an area that hasn't had support previously, it does leave gaps. And it leaves, that the biggest gap is businesses that don't have any business rates liability. So I think that's, it is outside the scope of this scheme, but it's something that I'll take away and we'll be able to have a look at. And yes, I've noted the other areas that you've mentioned, which we'll consider.
Thank you. Tracy?
Thank you, Chair. I mean, just to add to that, you know, this scheme is prescribed, so there is no scope for us to start to look to allocate this to businesses that don't pay business rates. There has, over the last couple of years, been schemes to support companies, sole traders, businesses who don't pay business rates. I think members should, pre my time, but members should have been updated around those different grants, so additional, I'm thinking of additional restrictions grant, but that might be the wrong one, but there are certain different COVID-related grants over the last couple of years that has been administered. And I think, you know, thinking about these types of businesses, and potentially John's right in terms of, you know, identifying there will be a proportion of businesses that have perhaps been unsupported for a period of time. I think, you know, notwithstanding, it's about signposting those businesses to other grant funding opportunities now. The LEP, for example, I think, you know, we've got a role in that. So looking to our economic regeneration manager, Jeffrey Kenyon, who is working on, who has recently launched a business microsite. That is an opportunity for us to start to share and signpost businesses to alternative funding streams, funding sources.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just remind the three remaining speakers that please no repetition of what we've already gone through, something new please. Councillor Bolter.
Move on, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Allen.
Yeah, just very quickly, I just wanted to know, roughly, do you have a number of how many businesses have actually slipped through the net? And if so, do you envisage any underspend here, and what will we do if we do have an underspend here?
For the underspend to start with, any underspend is paid back at the end of the reconciliation period. So there's no scope for doing anything else with that. In terms of those that have slipped through the net, again, we manage business rates in revenues and benefits. So the data that we have is around those businesses with a liability for business rates. We can see which of those have had support and which haven't, and we will know which of those we can support with this scheme. And again, there may be businesses at the end of this scheme that still either haven't been able to get support or haven't applied, haven't opted into that support. But we will have a record and an understanding of which businesses those are.
Thank you. Councillor Lily Kaufman.
Thank you. Very quickly then, the eligibility of street vendors who have to buy licences, and also market traders who have to pay rent. Perhaps you could take that away with you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. You want to say anything, Tracy?
I think just to Councillor Allen's point around businesses that have slipped through the net, I mean, you know, happy, I think we can facilitate some information being shared back, perhaps from our economic regeneration team around business support and production with the, obviously, the grants schemes that have been administered over the past couple of years, and then, you know, how businesses are reasonably supported by the council going forward. That's of interest.
Thank you. Right, there are three recommendations. John has got an awful lot to go away with and look at, confirm or deny. But as I said, it's a prescribed scheme, so it's got to work within certain parameters. But the recommendations are A, B and C. I'll move them. Is there a seconder? Thank you. Councillor Morris, all in favour? Unanimous, thank you. Agenda item 14, special severance payments.
Thank you, Chair. Again, on behalf of the Head of Building Democracy and Monitoring Officer, the purpose of this report is to inform members of the publication of contents of statutory guidance issued by the new Department of Housing and Communities in relation to making and publication of special severance payments by local authorities. The report sets out this statutory guidance, which all centres around obtaining best value, which all local authorities need to have regard to when making such payments, and the type of payments to fall within the purview of the guidance, and the related governance issues in terms of amending the constitution as set out in paragraphs 5.7, 8 and 9 in order to give effect to the statutory guidance. I'm happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Bolter.
Move report, Chair.
Thank you. Before I second it, which I will, I just have one question. Have we made any SSP in the last 5 years, Mr. Ball?
On the top of my head, Chair, it would just have to be something that we come back to you on.
If you could, please, thank you. So I'll second it. Are there any other speakers? No, thank you. All in favour? Unanimous again, thank you. Agenda item 15, exclusion of the press and public. Resolved that under section 100A brackets 4 of the Local Government Act 1972, press and public now be excluded from the remainder of the meeting on the grounds that the business to be transacted involves the disclosure of exempt information as defined in Part 1 of the Schedule 12A of the Act in brackets as amended, and in all the circumstances the public interest in maintaining the exempt item outweighs the public interest in disclosing the exempt information. Will you... We need to move it. Move it.
Yeah.
Second, all in favour? Thank you. You can disconnect the debris from the thingy.